What is up, most distinguished patrons of this channel? So today we are going to be revisiting dual shield flux core in an interesting video that's a long time in the making. And what I mean by that is I should have had it done like 5 months ago. But hey, shit happens and it's better late than never, right? So let's get into it. So I'll put some links in the description of the previous testing videos, and I'm going to briefly go over what we found. But it would pay to watch them, but you can do whatever you want. So I bought a roll of 035 flux core dual shield. So this is flux core wire designed to be run with shielding gas. It's not just straight gasless flux core. And I bought it from Blue Demon off of Amazon, and I ran the 035 spool. Had a lot of issues with the spool, which was basically due to Amazon dropping the package and busting up the plastic. And long story short, had really unfavorable results with the product. Now, 035 dual shield is not offered by a lot of companies. It's pretty uncommon because dual shield wire is generally used to weld pretty thick material, and 035 wire just doesn't have the metal deposition due to the diameter to really do a lot of thick material fast. So after a lot of investigation on the product, I kind of found out the general consensus was 035 dual shield was really meant to weld 1/8 inch and maybe 3/16 and nothing thicker than that. And when I welded thicker than that, meaning 1/4 and 3/8 plates in the previous videos, I had serious issues with penetration. It basically had zero. And a lot of people came and said, well, maybe try 100% CO2 gas. So that's something we will be testing in this video. I'm going to rerun the 035 flux core with both C25 like I did in the video, and I'm going to run 100% CO2. I'm hoping the 100% CO2 results in deeper penetration or some penetration, because it had literally none. And that's one of those things where, well, we got to test it to find out if it makes a difference. What I think is going to make a bigger difference than the shielding gas is going to a proper size wire for what we're going to be running for thickness, so 1/4 inch and 3/8. And that's why I bought another roll. This is 045. 045 wire can handle a lot more amperage, because you guys got to remember, this is a hollow tube with flux in it. And when you're putting the beans to something like this, it's only going to be able to handle so much current before the wire just blows apart. So 035, being that it's hollow, simply cannot handle enough current. And I found with the gasless flux core that 035 wire tends to start producing porosity and having poor welds at 1/4 inch and above. So it's not too surprising that arguably a similar product that uses gas shielding would have issues on 1/4 inch plate, because it simply wasn't designed for it. So I got 045 wire here to try that aspect as well. Now there's a couple other things I want to mention here. When I did the previous video, I was using my Firepower FP200 MIG welder, which is a great MIG welder. However, when you run it on a generator like I do, you have some severe power limitations, because the unit, well, for one, is only a 200 amp machine, and two, the unit does not have power factor correction. So part of the issues I had with the previous video is I was only able to run so much output power before the generator breaker would trip. So that limited us. Now in this video, I'm going to be running off my Rebel 235, which is far more powerful, has power factor correction. So long story short, it runs on a generator far better. So that's all good things. The other thing I'm going to mention is dual shield wire isn't something that you're probably going to be able to run very well in a typical home hobby MIG welder. And what I mean by that is dual shield wire requires higher voltage than what your machine may be able to output. This 045 wire probably starts at about 25 volts. 035 is about that, and most home hobby machines simply cannot output that kind of voltage. So before you go and buy any of these dual shield products, make sure your welder is actually capable of the voltage required to run it. The other thing is that you got to remember too is that the 035 wire, I don't think we're going to get acceptable results and performance out of on thicker plate. So that leaves us to go to 045. Well, 045 wire may not even be compatible with your welder itself, because it's very common with home hobby type machines to not have 045 drive rollers or even MIG gun liners for that sake. So again, make sure that if you want to try this product or anything similar, that your machine's actually capable both from a voltage, amperage, and from a parts availability. You know, you need contact tips, drive rollers, all of that. And if you can't get the liner or any of that, then you're not going to be able to run it, and you just wasted a ton of money on something that's useless. With that said, we're going to start out by welding beads on plate on here. I'm going to use the 035 and I'm going to run a bead, then we're going to switch to CO2 gas and I'll run a bead, and then we'll go through it from there, and then we'll do a cut and etch. So I got the plates cut apart and etched up to where we can see what's going on. And kind of the interesting thing is that, well, I found out the results before you, but I'll let you see firsthand. So let's start out with the C25. So all of these are done with 035 wire at progressively higher settings. And I was able to run a lot higher settings than I did in the previous video with this product. And you can see that the penetration really isn't getting that much better. No doubt there's a difference between the lowest and the highest, but it's not night and day different. Obviously the welds are bigger as you increase wire feed speed, but the penetration really isn't any better going with higher numbers. So at this point I would say the 035 with C25 gas isn't really going to be too suitable for welding 1/4 inch plate. Sure, you can put down big pretty welds with it, but on a fillet weld I'd be highly suspect that you're going to have 0 root fusion with this product, which is too bad. But again, I don't think it was ever designed to weld thicker plate, despite the fact it is dual shield. Well, let's look at the C25 versus C100 comparison. So here we go, comparison between C25 and C100. The gas mixture is above each weld. At the lower values, we can see not a huge difference between them. Honestly, depending on where I did the cut and etch, it might have been a toss-up. So the C100, shockingly enough, does not appear to have as much of a difference on this wire as it does with like hard wire in the short circuit process. It made a huge difference in root penetration. When we look at the higher values, there's a subtle difference where it's a little bit deeper for wider. Now the weld is wider itself, so maybe my travel speed was a little bit slower. But realistically, none of these have that great of penetration. I mean, this is, I would say, less than a 60-13 typically would have. Pretty comparable to that, or a 70-14 would be a better comparison. And I have a feeling if I did the cut and etch at a different point in the plate, that the results might even be closer than what we're seeing here. So C100 isn't really going to give you much more root fusion, I think, on a fillet weld, because we're not seeing anything there. All right, let's move on. So I gotta say the 035 dual shield results are pretty much lackluster, but I kind of expected that. I mean, based on the previous testing, why would it really be any better than that? I mean, the 100% CO2 had minimal gain, which is kind of a surprise. I would have thought it would have been a little bit better, but not really. But I think I figured out really what's going on here, and I alluded to it earlier in the video. So 035 dual shield is not made by many manufacturers, and trying to find set points on it is like finding a needle in a haystack. I've seen everything from 700 inches a minute to 400 to 29 volts to 22. Nobody seems to have an accurate idea what the hell to run this stuff at. Now, I can see, based on the cut and etch, a trend of increased penetration as the wire feed goes up. Now, as wire feed goes up, you produce more amperage, or the machine outputs more amperage. So what I think we have going on here is a pretty simple case of the wire itself, we're not feeding in enough, and we're not pulling enough amperage from the machine to get the performance, the melting of the steel that we want on 1/4 inch and above steel. So that's what's going on. Now, I glanced over when I was done welding on like these final welds at like 525 inch a minute, 27 volts, and the machine was only outputting 170 amps or so. You guys got to remember, this flux core wire is a hollow tube, and the amperage that it takes to basically not have a short, a direct short, isn't really that high. So what I really think is going on here is we're not transferring enough heat input into this, and had I ran maybe 600 inches a minute with this wire, that it might start to perform more like 045 and we would get better results. The problem is, I mean, that's a ludicrously high wire feed speed, and there will be detrimental problems, I think, running that high, and it's just not the way you should do it. And that's why they make 045 wire. You get a thicker wire that deposits more metal, therefore you can get more amperage at a lower wire feed. And let's be honest again, guys, if you have a 140 or even most 200 amp machines, you're not going to be able to even hit probably 500 inches a minute of wire speed anyways. So as far as I'm concerned, the 035 dual shield for home use with a home MIG machine is busted. I wouldn't recommend it. I don't think you're going to get much value out of it. If you're welding 1/8" material and you have a lot of it to do and you want to make real nice looking flat welds, it's worth it, but that's it. I mean, don't get me wrong, it welds easier out of position than MIG wire. Honestly, by far. I mean, vertical up is far easier at this, and it makes good looking welds. And even if you had minimal skill, I'm sure you could make a decent looking weld with this stuff. But honestly, I just don't see the use for it. And I think that's why so many manufacturers don't make an 035 version of this, because it just doesn't serve much of a purpose. So with that said, let's go get set up and start running some 045 and see if we can't get some better results on 1/4 inch plate. Well, I welded up a bunch of test specimens and cut and etched them and looked at the results, and pretty interesting. So right off the bat, a couple things. One, the C25 welds have a little bit of wormhole porosity in the surface. It appears to only be at the surface, and that was a direct result of running a bit too high a voltage. The chart that I had for this through ESOB had a little disclaimer at the bottom that said reduce voltage for C25 by a volt, volt and a half. Well, I didn't lower it by that much, therefore a combination of likely too short of a stick out and a little bit too high a voltage, we got some surface wormholes. Not a big deal. It's not really going to affect the penetration any, so just so you know, that's there. And I also did a test weld with 100% CO2 that I cut and etched on a fillet weld to where we could look at the penetration on that to see if it's any better as well than the previous video. So to start things off, let's use the C25 weld and see what we got. So here we go, 045 wire with C25 and C100. And we can start seeing there's some differences here compared to the 035 wire. When we look at the 300 inch a minute 26 volts, we can see the top right, which is C25. You can see that valley where the arrow's pointing to. That's that worm track that I mentioned. Generally speaking, with dual shield, you get worm tracks on the surface, but the internal weld is porosity free, and that's exactly what we see here. Nevertheless, it is a defect. Now, the voltage on the C25, because I ran the same voltage as with C100, is simply too high. And it kind of did weird things with the weld. If you look, the side penetration is better actually with the C25 than the C100. And I think, again, that's because the voltage was so high, it started biting more in at the toes of it. But the depth of penetration at the 300 inch is about equal. Now at the 340 inch a minute, there's actually a pretty significant difference between C100 and C25. You can see that C100 starting to actually get somewhere. So realistically, based on what I'm seeing here, I do think that C100 with higher values with bigger wire will perform better on 1/4 inch and thicker steel. And this testing kind of brings up an interesting point I didn't think of until I was editing the video. But to get any kind of fusion with this product, you're basically stuck running pretty high wire feed and a lot of amperage. Like the 340 inch a minute is somewhere around 220 amps a machine read. That's a lot of wire feed and a very big weld. So if you're welding, 1/4 inch or 3/8, you're going to have to move pretty quick and you're putting down a lot of metal fast. And if you think that it's wise to like cut back on your wire speed to kind of slow the travel speed, you're basically going to lose penetration. So that's not an ideal situation. All right, let's move on. So these welds really didn't have that great a penetration, and I'm starting to see a trend here that I don't know that this stuff is really going to have that great a penetration. It's more or less seems to be like a 70-18 where it has really good sidewalls, so the width of it is good on the penetration end, but the actual depth of it is somewhat limited, and that's kind of why I went and did this extra where I did same settings as what I used on this plate and ran a fillet weld with 100% CO2 gas just to see where we're at. So let's take a look at that. Two things right off the bat. One, my travel speed was a little bit fast. I deposited a little bit small of a weld given the settings. And two, I hit the bottom plate more than the upright plate. Partially too, the molten puddle probably sagged a little bit. But realistically, had I hit more of the upright plate for a 45-degree angle, it still wouldn't have fused the root any better, I guarantee you that. And I've done a ton of cut and etches with this product, and it just doesn't penetrate very well. And I think universally that's going to be the case with this, even at even higher settings, because this is 045 wire. It might get a little bit better, but again, not a very high penetration in the root process. Now, when we compare it to spray arc, that's significantly different. So let's look at that. So spray arc's on the left and normal short circuit MIG is on the right. And you can see that short circuit MIG, that there is zero root fusion, and that line underneath it is a complete lack of fusion. So very typical, and that's why you don't want to use short circuit on thick plate. And this is 1/2 inch thick steel. And you can see that the spray arc has no issue penetrating and fusing the root. Now the sidewall fusion really isn't that good with that, versus dual shield definitely has better sidewall fusion, which I like that better with the dual shield. Now let's look at all of them together. Top weld is on 1/2 inch plate, makes it look like the penetration difference isn't that significant, but trust me, it is. And you look at that dual shield on the bottom, and it is definitely better than C25 with short circuit, but it's not honestly as good as spray in my opinion. And keep in mind that both spray and dual shield require super high 26, 27 volts, a lot of wire feed, and a lot of amperage. The spray honestly was probably running a bit more amperage, but which one would you rather have? I'd take the spray. With that said, one thing you guys got to remember is that spray is generally done in a flat position, and without pulse, you're not going to be doing too much uphill or overhead welding with it, versus the dual shield can be run in all positions fairly easily. It's actually easier to weld out of position with dual shield than normal short circuit MIG. So that will play a role in your ability to weld with these on a project, and that is a limitation of spray. And also, the dual shield has better sidewall fusion, and that could also be a huge benefit depending on what you're welding. The last thing I'm going to mention that I haven't covered before is that dual shield probably has a better ability to weld through mill scale rust and surface contaminants over the spray arc. I have a feeling that the spray arc over mill scale and poor surface prep would probably have issues with porosity, among other things, so dual shield would probably weld on subpar material a little bit better. But honestly, the performance still isn't that great. Well, let's move on. So not the greatest root fusion, and I don't know that you're going to get this. I mean, no doubt I could raise the wire feed a lot higher than where I was at. But honestly, well, for one, my generator, I don't know that's going to run it. And two, then you're depositing even bigger of a weld. And for the material like the 1/4 inch here, that's really going to be almost too much metal for 3/8. Yeah, I could put a bigger weld in a single pass, but again, you know, I don't know that you're really going to just hammer that root and get huge fusion with this wire anyways. So with that said, let's take a look at these guys and let's do a shop press bend away from the face and see how they do. One of these was welded with C25, the other one was with 100% CO2. So got the two welds here, got the 100% CO2 and the C25. The C25 does, again, have a little bit of a worm track down the middle. I don't know that that's going to negatively affect it in the bend test, but hey, like my father always said, you got to pee with the pecker that you got. So we're going to test it anyways. Now, the C25 weld, I anticipate to bend fully and not fail. I don't believe this is going to fail. I believe that the 100% CO2 probably will not fail either. Now, I did a test with short circuit MIG with C25 and 100% CO2 gas, and 100% CO2 did not bend as far as the C25 did, and it ended up breaking. I don't think that this is going to be a repeat of that, but who knows. So let's see what happens. Let's start with the C25 first. And it broke. Not too surprising, I guess. I was wrong. Imagine that. Let's do the 100% CO2 now. And that passed. Wow. All right, let's go and look at them on the bench. Well, the bend test went opposite of what I would have thought, but I think there's a couple reasons. Number one, I should have dialed in these welds a little bit better than what I did. And the biggest flaw that I made with the C25 is I didn't reduce the voltage enough. I dropped it by like 1/2 volt or something, and that simply was not enough. And judging by all of the worm tracks in it, I think that the voltage was simply too high for this, and there likely was some undercut at the top, and that likely contributed towards why it broke. Looking back on the footage, I don't see too much evidence of undercut, but honestly, too high a voltage and the weld defects is a contributing factor, I guess I'll say. Now, the 100% CO2 weld held up really good, and root fusion is not something that affects a bend test like this because we're bending and stretching the weld itself, not the root. Therefore, stronger root penetration is of no concern or benefit in this test. But 100% CO2 had no issue passing, and I believe in my opinion, had I ran lower voltage and more correct settings for the C25, I think it would have passed as well. And as a matter of fact, I know it would pass because months and months ago, I actually did a bend test as part of showing someone how to weld with this product with the 045, and I had no issue passing a face bend like this. So again, I think it's just weld defects. It is what it is, you know, on that. This isn't meant to be a which one's better type video, so we'll just have to deal with it. All right, let's go to conclusion. Of course, right as I want to go to conclusion, it starts downpouring outside, and when you work out of a tin shop, it sounds like a naval battle's going on, so you can't film. But anyways, that's all over with. But you know what? I'm really glad it is raining a little bit, because I'm not joking. It's 100 plus in this tin shed, and I've been filming. This is probably hour number 6 that I've been shooting videos today, and I don't know if you can tell by how sweaty I am, and I just wiped my hands. But I am absolutely brain cooked, smoked in here. So I'm kind of glad that I'm almost done with this. But anyways, based on everything I saw in the testing, I can only really make one reasonable conclusion, and that is that I don't think for an average person that dual shield is a viable option. And the biggest limitation is the same limitation I found before, and that is it's so much based on how much power your welder has as to whether or not this even remotely works. So if you don't have a 250 amp class machine, you can forget about it. Like your average 200 amp MIG machine, you're going to go on thermal overload trying to push 26, 27 volts and the wire feed that I was running in here. So this really is not feasible in the home. I also don't like the root penetration that it has. It has about the least amount of root fusion I've seen outside of a 7014 rod. So that I don't like. Now, it is very strong in tension. Now this one, yeah, the C25 broke, but again, weld defects, wrong voltage, etc. And I'm not trying to come up with excuses, but realistically, I know that I could get that to pass simply by running more appropriate settings and taking care of the weld defects. So it is strong, but the lack of root fusion to me on a lot of things that I might weld, you kind of might want that, to be honest with you, and not having it could be an issue. It could lead to failures, but I do like the way it welds. It's very easy to weld with. I mean, pretty much anybody I think could weld with this stuff, and I really like the bead appearance. I like that perfectly flat, straight 45-degree angle. Like, that's also exceptional. It's just too bad, honestly, that the root fusion isn't that good, and the amount of power you need to run this stuff is pretty absurd. And once I finally can find a shop to take over and start running on a 50 amp circuit, you know, I'll in the future maybe retest this. But honestly, based on what I'm seeing with this product, I don't know that you're going to get too much better. So whether or not what it does matters for you, or I guess it depends on what you're working on. I don't particularly like it. And I think if I had more power available to my welder and really cranked it up, I might start seeing some more reasonable results. But I mean, Jesus, 200 amps at 27 volts still isn't enough on 1/4 inch plate, in my opinion. So it is what it is, guys. So with that said, if you got any comments or questions or thoughts on this, feel free to leave them. Until next time.